Hi, I'm Jarrett Fuller. Welcome to Scratching the Surface. When you imagine the future, what do you see? There's a good chance you might picture amorphous, organic-looking glass architecture, the streets populated with self-driving cars, sleek glass see-through devices in our hands. Maybe we're not even on Earth anymore, we're in space. There's probably lots of glowing blues and purple lights. Or maybe we're in a wasteland. The effects of climate change have finally taken over the planet, the world usurped by mega corporations. For some reason, when we think about the future, our images are strangely uncreative. The future, it seems, has homogenized around a few dominant images, the utopia, the dystopia. Even for designers, people in creative spaces, we often build upon these familiar images of the future. It's hard to see outside of what's already been presented to us, outside of the stories we've already been told. Nick Foster, in his new book, Could, Should, Might, Don't, How We Think About the Future, thinks this is a problem. He thinks the way we think and talk and imagine the future is nowhere near as rigorous as it could and should be. And Nick has been thinking about this for a long time. He's trained as an industrial designer at the Royal College of Art in the 90s, and he spent his career working, as he calls himself, as a futures designer, mostly for technology companies like Dyson, Sony, Nokia, Apple, and most recently as the head of design at Google X, Alphabet's moonshot factory, where he led a team of designers, researchers, and prototypers to think about emerging technologies like intelligent robots, self-driving cars, brain-controlled computer interfaces. This book, however, is not a book predicting the future or arguing for a particular future. It's not a book about technology or even design, really. It's instead, I think, a book trying to create a framework for a more serious discussion about how the present moment connects to various futures and what we should do about that. I found this book so helpful in piercing the myths that are often force-fed to us about the future, from tech CEOs at fancy product announcements, from strategy consultants with their charts and their data, and yes, from designers who create attractive images, selling us on a future and sometimes warning us about what is coming. So I invited Nick on the show to talk through all this with me. I wanted to think together with him about what it means to think about the future. I wanted to talk about the role of design in futures thinking, why it's important to take conversations about the future seriously, and how we explore these possibilities with more rigor. In the back half of the episode, we also talk about his own work, from studying industrial design to taking classes under the great designers Anthony Dunn and Fiona Raby, to his work at Google X and how he thought about design's role in those quote-unquote moonshot projects. This is one of those conversations that twists and turns and wrestles with some big ideas. I felt like Nick and I could have easily gone another hour, but I hope it gives you a preview of the ideas in his book and provides some new ways of talking about what we mean when we talk about the future. If you like the show and what we do here, you can support our work by joining our Substack. We have a monthly newsletter that's free for everybody over there, as well as a paid tier that gets you a bonus interview each month and help keeps this show free for everyone. My hope is that this show feels like you are listening in to a great conversation in a coffee shop. And so the way I like to think about it is that for the price of a cup of coffee each month, you can help us do this work. You can help us have these conversations and put more of them out into the world. But for now, here's me and Nick Foster. Nick, welcome to the show.
Nice to be here. Wow, it's good to be invited.
You've described yourself as a reluctant futurist, and I want to start there. What is a futurist, and why are you reluctant to call yourself one?
How long is this podcast recording?
We could go as
It's a
long as you want.
it's a good question. I mean, it's yeah. I think when you ask the question, what is a futurist? I think that's part of the problem, and I think it's something
Mhm.
that we haven't made sense of in society or in business or certainly in design. And if we have, it's something that I don't think we take very seriously. And for me, coming from where I come from and my own background, it just doesn't feel very serious as a discipline or a
Mm.
job even. Like when you put it alongside a welder or a farmer or a doctor or something,
Yeah.
like I'm a futurist feels like sort of not even a real thing. And I think that's partly because, without putting much stink on this, I think it's because the output of futurists is it's not rigorous. It's
Hmm.
typically like a little whimsical, a bit sort of out there in the stars, very theoretical,
Hmm.
very sort of open-ended, and it doesn't sort of form a core backbone of a lot of important work. And so I struggle to call myself a futurist, and it doesn't sort of fit well with me. I call myself a futures designer, which is probably just as pretentious, but I do struggle with the title.
That was my next question. You set up the next question perfectly because I did notice that in many places you refer to yourself as a futures designer. I don't want to get too semantic about this, but what does futures designer give you that futurist doesn't? Or what is it about that term that feels better, feels like it fits you? Maybe I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but feels more rigorous or serious in some way that futurist doesn't. Talk to me about that split a little bit.
It's a good question, and I should be clear that I think it's a term I made up.
Okay.
So
Even better then.
yeah, if people feel free to use it, but a futures designer. So I trained as a designer. I did a Bachelor of Science in Industrial Design, so very technical, rigorous, making things mindset. I still consider myself a designer above everything else. It's just that the topics that I focus on are typically beyond traditional sort of product horizons or contemporary projects, and starting to think
Mhm.
more purposefully about things that are a bit over the horizon or nascent or just in the lab or being thought about.
Yeah.
So in the same way that you might call yourself a garden designer or an
Hmm.
architectural designer, I'm a futures designer, and so my craft is design, my subject matter is futures, and so I put the two together because I think again, futurist is a very broad term, and it includes lots of people from lots of different disciplines that I don't feel a lot of kinship with. So I
Mm.
wanted to keep futures, I wanted to keep designer in there because that's what I do. I produce practical things that come from a designerly mindset.
I want to I want to go back to the designer piece of this in a second, but I want to stay on the futures part because you just wrote this new book. This really fascinating new book, by the way, called Could, Should, Might, Don't: How We Think About the Future. And in the introduction to this book, you write, when you imagine the future, you're much more likely to see a collage of ideas created by countless other people humming away in boardrooms, labs, and studios across the globe than something of your own making. And that struck me as so obvious and also something I've never thought about before. And so, can you talk to me about where these ideas of the future come from when we think about the future and we have this image in our heads? Where does this come from? And why is it a problem that we're all thinking about the future in similar ways?
Wow, that's an 80,000 word response required. No, it's a good question. I and again, this book is a means for me to sort of figure out my own opinions as well, as much as a manifesto or a
Mm-hmm.
statement of fact. But it does feel that way. It does feel like when I say to people, imagine the future, professional designers, engineers, scientists, business leaders, regular friends, folks,
Mm-hmm.
aunties, uncles,
Mm-hmm.
it feels like the things they tell me come from somewhere else, not from them, not from their gut, not from their brains. And I think it's because we're just surrounded by this swirling fog of opinion, conjecture, projection, prediction, data,
Mm-hmm.
ideas, visual stimulus, and it all sort of comes at us from all sides all the time, and so it sort of drowns out any of our ability to create our own ideas. And so you often find people regurgitate things that they've heard from somewhere else or seen from somewhere else or something they were told in a meeting one time.
Right, right.
And again, when I've been in these rooms with these So over my career, which maybe we can get into, but I've been in rooms with very, very diverse people. I'm a designer, but by dint of the work that I do, I've been around people from lots and lots of different disciplines. And whenever you're having a conversation about the present, the thing that you're working on now, the thing that you're producing, every opinion has to come with some very strong factual basis. You
Mm,
have to back up everything you say. You have to back up every idea that you have about what we should do and where, what it is
yeah.
we're looking at. But as soon as the conversation flips towards the future, people sort of don't know what to say or what to do, and they just sort of throw out the Jetsons or flying cars or Minority Report or
Yeah.
gestural interface or whatever it is. And I think that that betrays a truth, which is this is a skill that all of us, this is a sort of a medium that surrounds us all, but it's not a skill that we have to pick through it well and to make
Mm.
sense of it and to generate our own ideas. So, yeah, the main purpose of the book is to sort of start that conversation about the lack of ability that we all seem to have to rigorously think about the future and develop our own ideas.
Because after you talk about this idea that so much of what we think of as the future is this collage of images, you then write, and you started to say this in your previous answer. It's rare that a rigorous, structured orientation towards the future forms the central pillar of our thinking, and it's almost never integral to the ways in which most organizations, industries, or governments are built. This is a really obvious, slightly reductive question, but can you talk to me about why that matters? Why is it important for us as a society, for organizations, for governments, for industries and institutions to be rigorous when they think about the future? Um, like you were just saying, if we're talking about the present, we have all this data, we have these facts, we have these things that we need to know. And then when we go to the future, we don't have that. Why should we have that? Why is it important for us to be thinking about the future in this rigorous way?
Yeah, and this is we could talk about the reasons why it doesn't happen in industry perhaps later because I think
Yeah,
that they're
yeah,
valid and there's a lot of them. But yeah, I think it's important because I think all of us understand now. We're part of a generation. We look at me putting myself in the same age bracket as everyone else listening. I feel like we as a society are living through in a time capsule that was accidentally planted by our predecessors. And
yes,
we're
yeah,
the life that we're living today is a result of a lack of consideration about the future with rigor from people that existed before us. And I think we're waking up to that responsibility of like the things that we're doing now and the way that we can deploy things at such massive scale and create massive amounts of change very sort of simply comes with a level of responsibility and a stewardship for the future.
yeah,
And that sort of realization is starting to happen at the edges of society, culture, business, investment, invention, innovation.
right.
And I think people are starting to say, actually, we do have a role to play here, and this short-termism and the sort of single solutions oriented mindset that's dominated previous generations isn't working out for us. And so I do believe that having decent thinking time about the future is increasingly important, and more people are starting to realize that. But I still think that our ability to do so is significantly lower than it perhaps should be.
I think that's exactly right. I think one of the things I was thinking about when I was reading your book is how much of the ways we think and talk about the future are really ways to think and talk about what's happening right now. I think that's what you're starting to say a little bit. Like if we are too focused on short-term things in the present, that has ripple effects into the future. And when we go out to the future and think about the futures that we want, we actually have to start thinking about how do we get that today, that these are not actually disconnected, but we think about them as disconnected, I guess is what I'm trying to say. We think about the future as something else, something disconnected
Yeah.
from what's happening right now.
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, that really gets into the nub of it. And we can talk about the future mundane and my own
Yeah.
own sort
Yeah.
of ways of bringing rigor into my own work a bit later. But the future is coming.
Right.
There's no direction you can run that lets you avoid the weekend. It is coming. And the future is an evolution of the present. But we very rarely think of it as such. We
Yeah.
always think of the future as a sort of transformational place or a different place or somewhere, somehow other. We never really talk too much about the interstitial stages to get us there. Or if we do, they're very sort of performative, I would say.
Right. Right.
But I do think that sort of understanding of there is no beginning, middle, and end to something you introduce to the world. It's all middle.
Yes.
And in the book, I
Yeah.
talk about the transition from horses to vehicles in New York City, for example. And there's a long case study in the book about that, about how, horses were the primary mode of transportation at the time in New York City. They brought with them a huge amount of problems, most notably waste. And so the transition to the automobile seemed like a really smart thing, and it was seen as a sort of solution to a problem. But of course, that brought its own problems and its own knock-on effects and
Right.
pollution and congestion and the increase in separation between pedestrians and vehicles and all of the other things that we now live with are the result of that sort of short-term mindset that was saw a problem, saw a solution, executed it, and thought that was the end. But actually, as we all are starting to realize, things have a life beyond that sort of deliverable date.
And I think that's what your book does really well. Your book is not a prediction, a set of predictions about the future. Your book is not a history of the industry of futurism. You're not really um, kind of actually looking towards the future in this book. I think what you're really doing is what you just said. You're giving us, society, a set of tools to probe the futures that are being presented to us so we can start to see how do we get there? What does that? What would those interstitials be? And so, like I said, the book is called Could, Should, Might, Don't. And those four words become four frameworks to think about different ways of talking about the future. Could you talk through what each of those are, just really briefly, to set it up for listeners? Could futurism, should futurism, might futurism, don't futurism? What are all of those, and how do those fit together for you?
Yeah, I think there's a little context I want to add up front as well is
Yeah.
that I think we're surrounded by methodologies and frameworks and tools and hexagonal diagrams and mind maps and all these other things. They sort of, I think Stuart Candy calls them intellectual
Oh
prostheses.
yeah. Yeah.
This, which I didn't want to write that book. I don't want to write a book for futures practitioners. I don't want to create another method. I don't want to be a TED Talk guy. That's not my ambition here. What I'm trying to do is at least say, I think there's a taxonomy of four
Yes.
big
Taxonomy is a
buckets.
great word. Yeah.
Yeah, like there's this feeling that whenever we talk to somebody about the future, they tend to fall into one of these four corridors. And when I talk about rigor, all I'm basically saying is there might be three other corridors of thinking that
Right.
could be worth a look down at least.
Right.
And so that's all I'm trying to do with this book rather than say, here's the solution or here's the method you should adopt. So with that in mind, and that said, and that sort of caveat in place, I do think that we all fall into one of these four buckets, and myself included in all of this. And again, this book is not for practitioners necessarily. It's a broad appeal book. It's a book for consumers of futurism as much as creators of it. And that includes my family, my friends, people I know in the street, my neighbors, because I feel like we're all bamboozled with this stuff. And so we kind of nod along and kind of go, yeah, 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 I guess that's the
Yeah.
future. So
Yeah.
with that said, I think could futurism by its hopefully these are mostly self-explanatory, but could futurism is that idea of the future as a place of sort of opportunity and
Hmm.
optimism and all of things we could do. It's very sort of technocratic. It's a product of modernism. It's the sort of stuff if you type futuristic into Google Images, you see like the towering, gleaming architecture, the robot dogs, the flying machines, all that sort of stuff. And it sort of takes its lead from science fiction. And so, as science fiction's grown, this way of thinking about the future's grown.
Yeah.
It's the sort of stuff our on-stage futurists talk about a lot, and
Yes.
our
Yeah.
on-TV futurists talk about a lot. It's
I,
very
I
sort
think
of
of like the tech CEOs talking about what this new product is going to do for society as a type of could futurism when I was reading the book.
yeah, that's about right. I'm glad I communicated that.
Okay.
Yeah, it's very sort of excitable, and it's it,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
it's designed to widen your eyes and get you very sort of engaged, and that's why it's very popular because it's very allied to science fiction entertainment, and it feels like this escapist thing. And I think therein lies its sort of challenges is that it's very heroic.
Mm,
It typically follows the sort of same storytelling tropes as science fiction. It has a hero as its center. The
right.
people in Could Futurism are always CEOs or
Yeah.
gene therapists or some
Right.
person designing a rocket or something. They're
Yeah.
not normal, ordinary, everyday people. And again, back to what we were saying earlier, it does treat the future as this sort of other place
Hmm.
rather than an evolution of the present. And
Hmm.
so you see it a lot in corporate landscapes and you see it a lot in sort of on stage futurism, I would say. So that's sort of could futurism. It has its benefits that it gets people excited and motivated, but it feels sort of abstract and a little silly and a bit heroic. So should futurism is the next. And this is about trying to sort of divine some certainty in the future,
Hmm.
some end goal. And whenever people find out what I do for a living, this is they want a prediction, right?
Right.
Where are we going? What's this going to be? Is it really going to be 27% by 2027?
Right.
Like,
Right.
and it comes from a backbone of sort of folkloric tales about the future and trying to divine the future and predict the Nostradamus sort of way of thinking about the future, following the stars,
Hmm.
prediction, that sort
Hmm.
of thing.
Hmm.
But in recent times, it's been converted more into what we might call corporate strategy. So
Right.
using historical data to try and plot a chart to the future, the kind of work of your Bains and your McKinseys and your BCGs, and this way of saying this has happened in the past, and here's all the data, and if we project that data forwards, this is what we should do because
Right.
this is where we're going to be.
Right.
And obviously, the challenges with that is that once a solid line converts to a dotted line, it ceases to be data and
Right. Right.
it becomes a story. And I
Yeah.
think that there's a lack of honesty around should futurism, which is anything
Mm-hmm.
could happen. You know, a ship could get stuck in the Suez Canal. Oprah Winfrey could say something bad about your brand, whatever it is. But knowing that where that dot is in the future is a story, and it can sort of be anywhere and veered at any one time.
Right.
So should futurism is that sense of certainty and surety about the future that sometimes is a little false and artificial and can be nudged way off course by
Hmm.
unseen forces. Might futurism is the third, which is sort of the opposite of that, which is this idea of strategies and thinking pluralistically about the future. But this is the sort of world that you know, when you're playing chess or you're trying to think 3 or 4 moves ahead,
Hmm.
and it
Hmm.
sort of got formalized in by people like Rand and Herman Kahn and
Right.
strategic sort of foresight, scenario building stuff. It's very much the modus operandi of sort of professional consultant futurists right now to think of all of the stories that we could tell about the future and
Hmm.
map out the terrain and the Voros cone and all of this sort of
Right.
stuff.
Right. Right.
The challenge with that is our imagination about future scenarios is pretty poor. You know,
Right.
just ask Blockbuster or Nokia or
Right.
Nokia or Kodak or something. Like
Yeah.
we can't see things in the future that we haven't experienced in the past typically. So that means we're always short of scenarios.
Right.
And it's only based on the data that we have. And typically we don't have very much data, or the data that we seek is not available. So it's difficult for us to see all the
Yeah.
paths ahead of us.
I mean, it sort of goes back to that early question about so much of what we think about the future looks similar, feels similar. It is a collage of things. I think that's the limit of might future, or at least that was my limit of the limit I was reading when you were talking about might futurism, is that it's a lot of just repeating stories that we already are familiar with in some way and just
Yes.
changing them slightly in some way.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the analogies that I have in the book is that's why stage magic works. You know,
Yeah.
when you see an
Yeah.
illusion, when somebody pulls something out of a previously empty box, we're wondered by it because we haven't seen that scenario before. Our brains haven't experienced that
Right.
scenario before. And I actually interviewed a brain researcher, actually, Joseph Cable, who talks about this evolving notion of memory as a place to start thinking about the future. And actually, it's very difficult for us to imagine things that haven't happened before. And so when we're talking about what might happen in the future, we're naturally hamstrung by our experiences of the world. And that also comes down to who we are as people and the lives that we've lived. And I'm a sort of white middle-aged person in
Yeah.
Silicon Valley, so my experiences are very kind of unique to my own existence, and I'm aware of that. And so the final version is don't futurism, which is just around this sort of bracketing out, which is a way of looking at the future as and trying to define the things that we should stop or divert away from.
Mm.
And you know, as children, this is a very strong thing that we're taught. All of our nursery rhymes and folk tales are around don't do this because that might happen and it would be bad.
Yeah.
And the challenge of sort of don't futurism is it's essentially built around ideologies of things that we're trying to sort of divert ourselves away from. And it's typically the role of sort of opposition politics. And we shouldn't go there because all this bad stuff could happen. I think that's the sort of blunt version of don't futurism. And it's where conflict and protest comes from. But I think there's a more nuanced version of don't futurism, which has evolved and is sort of characterized by things like critical and speculative design
Hmm.
now, which is thinking more responsibly about the impact of the things we're bringing and perhaps the negative externalities of the things we're bringing, and this sort of broad version of the future to
Yeah.
try and maybe the future, which is less about more and more about less. This idea of the future as a place where we cut things away as opposed to add more. And so I'm not saying that each of those four things is a unique thing in its own right. They all overlap. They're caricatures. I get that. But I do think that myself, and I'm sure most people listening, find themselves falling into one of those four corridors whenever we're talking about or thinking about the future at work or in a bar or wherever it is. We find ourselves sort of funneled into that. And what I found is if you're able to be conscious of that at least,
Yes.
and spread yourself across those corridors a bit more broadly, I think the stories we tell about the future become quite a lot and quite noticeably richer.
Oh, that's a really good way to put that, because something that I was thinking about, there were two things that I was thinking about as I was reading the book, and as you were outlining them again here, is, and I love that you referred to this as a taxonomy, which I think is a better phrasing than the structure or the quadrants that I was talking about. But the thing I was thinking about is how each of these quadrants use some of the others to bolster their dominant quadrant. And so, for example, you have the tech CEO who says within 10 years, X% of white collar jobs will be eradicated because of AI. Look what AI can do. So that's a mix of should. It's giving us that data. It's extrapolating from historical data, but then it's presenting a kind of glorious image for us, or not glorious image, depending on kind of where you fall on that. But so that's one piece, is that that all of them sometimes will use some of the others. But the other piece of it, and I think this comes across in the way you described all of them, is that all of them fall short in various ways. They all have limits, that they are all insufficient. How do you think about that? How do you think about the limits of each of them, and how we can kind of be aware of those limits, so when a future is being presented to us, we can understand what it is doing or what it is trying to do? Does that make sense? I sort of threw a
It
bunch of
does,
different
yeah.
things up there, but
No,
can
no,
you? Okay.
no. It's a good one, and I don't necessarily have a solid thesis to present back, but here's where I'll start. I think what I've defined are kind of monocultures. And I think
Mm,
you're right that let's say this tech
yeah.
CEO will stand up and he'll
Yeah.
use data and then say, therefore, we should do this. And this is the world that we could create.
Yeah.
At least that's spreading across, let's say, two of these channels. But what it doesn't do, it doesn't embrace all of the other things we might do, and these things
Exactly.
might happen. It doesn't embrace any levels of uncertainty or a lack of certainty, let's say, and it certainly doesn't embrace these are the negative things that could come because of what we're going to do, and these are the things that we're still not sure how we might fix in the future, which is the sort of don't futurist way of
Right.
thinking. And I think all I'm saying is like it's fine to just do one, but understand that it is a one-legged table then.
Yeah.
And if you start to look at the breadth of ways of thinking about the future, you suddenly realize it's a hell of a lot of work.
Yeah.
And actually, if you are to go deep into all four of these, I don't know, columns, channels, corridors, whatever we want to call them,
Yeah.
it's a lot of work. And I think therein lies the problem, is that it requires a lot of investment, a lot of different skill sets, a lot of disciplines. And you have to start building a really kind of capable team to deliver this kind of work at the kind of rigorous levels that I'm keen that we push towards. And I
Yeah.
sort of, obviously, I would say that because this is my trade. But I think what I'm also trying to say is to people like you can't just hire a sort of numbers analyst and say we have a futures team. You can't just have like an ethics team and say we have a futures team, because
Right.
they're each doing a bit of the problem. And I think that's what I mean when I say that futures work or futurists feel underpowered, is because they typically deliver one of these columns.
Right. Right.
And I think
That's well
that's where
said.
the work struggles. And so it always feels sort of underpowered and kind of easy to ignore or dismiss by the rest of an organization or the rest of a society.
I think that's really well said. And I think what's interesting is, or what I kind of want to hear you talk a little bit more about, is you don't really present solutions to these in the book. You don't really sort of say, and now here's the way that we should think about the future. I think the closest you get is, and I think that's good, by the way. I'm not that's not a criticism of the book. I think the closest that you get is this idea of the future mundane, which is a kind of manifesto essay that you published about 10 years ago or so, which to me feels like an attempt to ground some of these things that you're talking about, some of the problems that you're talking about. And so the future mundane is this idea that the future is filled with background talent, it is accretive, and it is a bit broken. Tell me what the future mundane is and how you see that as maybe a counterpoint or another layer to these futures that you're
Mm-mm.
talking about, or how that fits in as a way to inject some of this rigor that you're calling for.
Yeah, this is my own sort of personal application of this recognition of this sort of lack of power in futures
Mm,
work. So if we scroll back early days, so late 90s, I started my career. And in the sort of first 5, 6, 7, 8 years of my career, I did a lot of CUD futurism. I
mm.
produced a lot of sexy renderings, future vision projects, that kind of stuff. And I thought that's what you were supposed to
Right,
do. Like
right.
I thought that's what I was trained that you were supposed to produce. And clients seemed happy with that. They paid for it. They seemed
Right.
excited. It made its way onto their websites and into their corporate strategy decks and things. But
Yeah.
it never really went much further than that. And so I always had this sort of niggling feeling as well when I was presenting these things. I come from Derby, which is like a post-industrial damp city in the middle of
Okay.
England,
Yeah.
surrounded by sort of the kind of regular, ordinary, everyday stories that most people are familiar with. And when I was presenting some of these ideas, like Derek on the bus just kept creeping into the back of my mind, and
Right.
Sally who works at Safeway kept creeping into my mind, and I just sort of felt this is silly. It's a pantomime. So I started to look around as well, like at the films that I like, the films by Shane Meadows, and the
Mm.
photography I like, people like Martin Parr, who
Hmm.
chart this sort of everyday lived experience of the world, and
Yeah.
started to think, why, when we talk about the future, don't we think in those ways? So my own sort of passion project, I suppose you would say, about bringing some level of rigor to my work was I've spent time working at the very cutting edge of emerging technologies. And it's very actually easy and quite lazy to talk about how, a gene scientist or a rocket engineer might use VR. But what about the person that works at Safeway or the fella on the
Right.
bus or my family, my friends, the people I grew up with, the places I
Yes.
know?
Yeah.
And actually that grounding of the future. So I refer to these people as background talent. And that's not in any way to demean what they do. But I think it stops us looking at the stars and the heroes at the front of the screen and starts looking at all of the rest of us in the middle of the bell curve who are in the background of the scene. And actually,
Yeah.
it's just good business. It's a huge market. Let's be
Yeah.
honest. It's a huge market, and so trying to focus on that notion of the future being populated by ordinary, everyday people. The other two things you mentioned about accretion and being a bit broken are more trying to add context, which is the future doesn't just arrive like an egg breaking and delivered. It builds on the past. So we have new things in our lives, but we also have coat hangers and biro pens and bits of old stuff we've inherited. So the future just piles on the past, and rendering the future as a place of accretion is a way to bring that kind of level of reality and rigor to it. And an acknowledgement that everything is sort of broken all the time, at least in some regard.
Right.
Things decay, things don't quite work how either they're supposed to, or they definitely aren't used how the creators hope they're going to be used. People kludge things, they
Yeah.
like mess around with things, they use technology in ways that we hadn't foreseen or
Right.
hoped.
Right.
And so again, just trying to bring that level of reality to futures work has been useful in my career to help ground a conversation and get us out of the Jetsons flying car excitable or even like crazy dystopian horror show stuff that we spend so long talking about at the moment. And again, a long sort of manifesto type speech from me here. I appreciate that, but it is a way for us to sort of wrap our arms around the future and say it's going to be a lived place where people like us are going to exist, and we need to figure out what that is going to look like.
Let me ask how you do that in practice. I love the future mundane. I teach some speculative design classes and do some speculative design projects with students, and I think that's now a framework that I'm using in studio classes because I think this is a little bit of a tangent, but I think students tend to fall into the future as something different. It gets too science fiction, all the stuff that you're sort of critiquing. And I think the future mundane is a really good way to ground that. You most recently were the design director of Google X, which has been defined as Google's moonshot ideas factory. So I have two questions. Can you just sort of define the purview of Google X and how that sits within Google? And then you've talked a couple times about your background as a designer. You were the design director of Google X. How does design fit within the Moonshot Factory? What is the role of design within this organization, which is then part of this bigger organization? Can you talk to me a little bit about those layers?
Yeah, absolutely. So Google X is a sort of separate part of Alphabet. So Alphabet, the holding
Hmm.
company of Google and all of the others. And the aim is to specifically work on what they call moonshot projects. So big, ambitious, sort of technology-led projects which have an outsized impact on the world. And the nature of some of those projects, or all of those projects, is that the majority of them don't make it. They have to
Hmm.
be so
Right.
audacious and so ambitious and so sort of a little bit like, really? That for Google or Alphabet to invest in them, they feel like they have to be of that sort of scale, and that means the hit rate is very low.
Right.
And that's, I've worked on everything from neighborhood scale nuclear fusion to automation projects, robotic projects, all sorts of sort of
Yeah.
interesting,
Wow.
wild,
Wow. Yeah.
sort of fantastical kinds of projects. Very rewarding work. Really, really talented people. I think the role of design in an organization like that is obviously not to be in the sort of delivery mode. It is in the shaping ideas, telling stories, knocking off the edges, giving an idea some
Uh-huh.
sort of real shape. Because the truth of it is the people that generate these ideas are typically from a technical background, a science or an engineering or sort of invention mindset, and often can fall into some of those patterns of we're not
Yeah.
really sure. We're just very excited and we're so in the work. We
Yeah.
sort of can't communicate the shape of the benefit. So the work that my team did a lot of was building prototypes, telling stories, starting to like define a what we call a PRD, product requirement document,
Okay.
starting to define like this is the sort of thing that we think might make the most sense for customers, for users. This is the sort of thing that we think this is pointing at. This is the shape of the opportunity. And obviously, there was a strategy team who would do the same from a kind of business opportunity perspective and say, this is the shape of the market, this is the shape of the financial opportunity. And so my team's role was to jump in on all of these projects. And we worked on, I think, in my tenure, over 200 of these investigations.
Oh, wow.
So some of them lasted like a day or two, and some of them continued longer than my
Yeah.
own tenure. So and the idea is to start a lot of things, try and kill them quickly. And if you don't succeed in killing them quickly, then there's something there. And so, yeah,
Yeah.
the design work would go. And typically, my team would step away once the project was big enough where they felt like they could hire their first designer. So we were this sort of
Okay.
little commando team that would get in right at the beginning and say, right, well, they need a prototype. They need a little works like prototype. They need some thinking, writing, shaping, diagramming around what this thing is. Trying to find what I call the grain in a technology, trying to
Hmm.
find the directionality of the technology.
Yeah, you've talked a lot about your role as being not about what the technology can do, but what it means, how it affects everything else around it, which I really like. And I have a question, Nick, that I'm not totally sure how to ask. So I'm going to just talk a little bit and hope this this forms a question because I'm thinking about everything that we've talked about so far, and I'm thinking about the role of design in an organization like Google X or any sort of futures moonshot kind of initiative. And I think design can do two things. This is a little bit reductive, but I think design could do two things. It could, on one side, perpetuate all this kind of standard uncritical futures that we've been talking about. It can make things look really shiny, it can make things sexy, it can make it like sellable so it becomes a thing. Let's use design to make this a thing that people will buy into and give us money and we can turn this thing into a reality. But then design could also do the future mundane. It could ground it. It could say, let's take this out of the future and let's put this into a real setting. Let's actually make this real for good and for bad. Let's examine the quote unquote unintended consequences. Let's be critical of this idea to lean into the kind of critical design that you mentioned earlier and really wrestle with what this thing would mean. You, as the former design director, how did you think about the role of design there so you don't lean into let's make beautiful blue, purple, glowing images of the future and let's root this in something real. And the reason I'm asking you this, and I'm sorry, this is like a little bit of a tangent, but as you're talking about this, it seems like that's the thing that designers actually really bring to futures work is that making it real, is that examining the landscape, examining the mundane of it. But far too often design does the opposite. But it seems like designers are trained to really examine how this thing's going to work, how will people interact with this, what materials would we use. How do you think about that balance? Can you just sort of talk me through that a little bit?
Yeah, of course, I'll give it a go. I think over my career, and certainly even if we just talk about Google X, the fact that we were working on so many different technologies, so many different ideas, so many different types of people, and so many individuals meant that I got a lot of reads on how design shows up to people and
Mm,
what they expect from it. And
hmm.
there were obviously people who did just want something shiny. Can you do me a logo? Can I have a deck, please?
Right.
Which, there's also good value in doing that work too. It's not the work that I'm most keen on in futures work, and I don't think it's the most important work. And I think actually as I approach either the second half or the final third of my own career, I'm also very, very conscious that there's a new generation of designers coming through. And I'm actually really enamored with the way that design is sort of reconsidering its own purpose
Mm,
in the world. And there's this whole new generation of designers that are coming through who are thinking about design in a way that I certainly didn't when I was graduating. When I was a kid growing up in the 80s, the future was a very exciting place. It was a
yeah.
very sort of, whiz bang technocratic. The future's full of gadgets. All the movies I watched, every TV show I watched, everything I consumed was
Yeah.
about progress through technology. And also the same for my father's generation growing up in post-war UK. The repurposing of technologies developed in the war, like made everybody start to think, oh, we can do these things now. And we now have
Yeah.
radios and we have
Yeah.
this and we have that. And I think the new generation of people, but also design graduates, are starting to think about the world the future in a very different way than I grew up. So I'm trying to retrain myself as well. And I'm actually quite impressed with the new generation of designers that we have coming into the workforce who are starting to look at the purpose of what design has in an organization differently than I did. And that is a position of responsibility. It is a position of uncertainty. It is a position of stewardship. It is a position of understanding the implications and not just being a sort of a capitalist tool, let's
Right.
say, and
Right.
trying to sort of do things with a bit more intention. Now, that does butt up against the very first part of what I said, which is the expectations of design. And I think design does need to find a way to play in that middle ground where it can't just be stridently, speculative design or something, because it
Yeah.
won't find its way into the boardroom. But it can't just be, we'll do whatever you want. And I think that gray boundary is the place that I tried to play and hopefully help the team that I was leading play. Understand your audience and try and teach and lead, but also deliver. That's a challenging balance, but I love the fact that design can play in that space where we can deliver beautiful gloss and convincing material and artifacts that help people make a decision, but we can also provoke and push and ask very difficult questions of people with the intention of sort of pushing them towards more responsibility about what they're doing.
That really helps me make sense of a tension that I was feeling in reading the book and also the tension that I feel in design sometimes. And so I'm articulating this for the first time. And this is this was not a planned question for you. And I want to kind of hear how you think about this because I think you're onto something when you start to talk about your own childhood and the the ideas of the future as being something exciting, something that we should be looking forward to, something that we should be working towards. I even see that in my own career 15 years ago when I started design, and I don't mean to keep bringing this back to the tech industry, but that's the industry I was in for a while. The optimism around that compared to the criticism around it today, which I think is very good. But that can also lean into a general malaise about the future. the future is not something we should be looking forward to. You talk about this at the beginning of the book. People think things are going poorly, but there's so much data to say that we're actually still sort of moving in the right direction in some ways. And how does design, or maybe more specifically, how do designers find that intersection, that tension, that balance? I don't even know the language for that,
Mm.
because we should be excited about the future. We should make the future something that we are looking forward to, but and aware of all the downsides, all the negative thing. Like how can design kind of sit between those to make the futures? I shouldn't even say the future, that there are future possibilities that are positive, that it's not all negative, but all those positive futures also have negative byproducts. Like how does design kind of sit in those poles? Does any of that making sense?
The fact that you're struggling around the language here is exactly the shape of the conversation that we're in right now.
Okay.
Which no,
Yeah.
I mean that like it's very sort of straightforward to fall, like I said, into one of these ways of
Yeah.
thinking.
Right.
And I feel like design has found itself very strongly in the sort of the design I'm around anyway. Let's be clear on that. Feels like it's fallen very cleanly into the don't
Mm.
category of late.
Hmm.
And also society at large is falling quite heavily into the don't category.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there's this general malaise you talk about, this ambient adolescent apocalypticism, which is sort of moving like a curse through our young people, this feeling of looking to the future and feeling dread and fear. And it's very easy for somebody like me to say, we shouldn't do that. We should focus on the good things. But it all
Right.
comes from valid places. And
Right.
I feel a lot of it myself. The challenge is it often sits extrinsically to the things that it wants to change. And it can be accused sometimes of sitting there and just wagging its finger and being sort of splitting the world into these sort of fairly simplistic, pugnacious power and opposition arguments, which I don't think is overly helpful. It sometimes represents a last resort. And I understand
Hmm.
where protest and strong feeling comes from and this feeling of dread about the future. And again, I share a lot of those feelings. But the next step beyond that is to step in and try and shape some of these things, offer alternatives, show
Right.
possibilities, like
Right.
engage
Right.
in the debate. And I think that's the part where I feel like people don't close the loop. And it does leave you in this sort of wallowy place that I think leads to this increase in this feeling of malaise. And I really hope people listening don't think that I'm dismissing it or diminishing the feelings that come from that. But it does require change. Always comes from a proposition as opposed to just an opposition. You have to put something down that says this could be interesting. Why don't we try this? I'm going to try and
Yeah.
do this actually, and we could do this together, and who's with me, and let's go. And it doesn't have to be something strident like a manifesto. Like I would love to see more critical and speculative designers applying for jobs in Google and
Hmm.
Facebook and big tech companies, or the big oil companies or whatever it is. I think those sorts of moves are really exciting and interesting to me
Mm.
when you sort of try and be part of the thing you're trying to change. Now I admit, like you face a lot of sort of cynicism and accusation if you do that. And I've come into some of that myself by the dint of the roles that I've had. But I do feel like some of the work that I've done has meaningfully nudged things in a direction that I approve of more. Like I do
Yeah.
feel like I've contributed to some meaningful change in some of the conversations I've been a part of. And I can sort of live with that. So it is very tricky territory. And again, your language and the language that I'm clearly like being very careful about in my
Right.
response, it tells a story of its own. But I'd rather be involved in trying to think broadly about this work rather than sort of lean back, fold my arms, and
Yeah.
wag my finger because I feel like it doesn't take us anywhere useful.
Yeah, and I think that's the struggle that I have, because I think I see design, and you write this in the book also, as an inherently optimistic enterprise. To be a designer is to believe that you can make some sort of change, however small, to design something that affects all of these other things. But then you're also faced with the reality, and so I sort of feel this inherent tension just in myself, of being both like excited about the future, but also very aware of how all of these things could go wrong. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about this idea of wanting to see critical designers, speculative designers go into a Google, Apple, an Amazon. You write in the book in 2022, Meta, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Google collectively spent $177 billion on research and development, which you caveat is not all considered futurism, but is this indicator of how much these large organizations are thinking about the future. What would it look like for that to be filled with critical designers or speculative designers? What kind of influence do you think they would have in that type of work?
Well, I don't think it should be filled with critical and
Okay. Oh
speculative
yeah.
designers.
Sorry.
I feel like there should be space for that kind of thinking in these
Yeah.
organizations. And one of the things I wrestle with a little bit in the book, and I can't honestly say I've fully resolved in my own head, is this notion of better.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Mm-hmm.
write quite a bit about better, and I think Daisy Ginsburg wrote a PhD on better as a
Mm.
problematic term because it is basically an ideological position. And when I say better in a room full of designers, I'm sort of making a bet that they're all politically aligned with me, or they all have an idea of the future that they want to see, built around typically sort of liberal or left party politics. I think that's a challenge actually.
Mm.
And one of the things that's really important is being honest about your ideological intentions. And so when I was in a yeah, actually the mission statement of Google X was to make the world a radically better place was
Oh
included in
right.
there
Right.
without really ever sort of saying what better meant.
Right.
And so when I was in a meeting room at Google X, let's say, or at Sony or at Nokia or at Dyson or anywhere, certainly in Silicon Valley, you must be familiar with this. You can be in a room of, say, 10 people, and there'll be somebody with a MA.
Mm-hmm.
There'll be somebody who's like a 60-year-old computer science grad who rides a recumbent bicycle with a big beard. There'll be
Yeah.
some guy in a puffy vest who's come from venture capital,
Yep.
McKinsey background.
Yep.
There'll be some sort of person who's the son or daughter of some hippies that grew up in Haight Ashbury. All these people are in a room trying to build the next tech thing. So when you say the word better, we should do this because it would be better. It's actually really hard to know what anyone means.
Yeah.
And so this is a long way of saying, putting yourself, if you are a critical designer, speculative designer, if you're a person coming from this, like wanting to make change in the world, in those environments, it forces you to either interrogate your own ideology or your own belief of better, or like try and find a way to encourage other people to see the world your way, or trying to like
Yeah.
nuance the way you're delivering your work in a way that's more understandable, compatible,
Yeah.
engageable for other people. Whereas the thing I worry about, I love the fact that critical and speculative design exists, and I'm sort of a product of that world. I was at
Mm-hmm.
the RCA in '99 and Dunn and Raby, all that
Yep.
generation. I'm
Yep.
around these people. The challenge I have with it is extrinsic typically. It does sit outside of these things it purports to want to change, and it sort of talks to the room that it knows its audience and it talks to itself. And not all of it, of course, and a
Yeah.
lot of it has good intentions and good impact, but I do have a problem with that. And so, long way of saying it would be great to have more people feeling like that they could take part in these conversations and be part of larger design teams. And I actually do think it's changing. Like with my own eyes, I've seen the discourse changing in design in professional circles.
Mm. Well, I think you're onto something, but I haven't quite reconciled this either because I agree with you, and that's why I admire your work and the people that can go into these organizations and bring that criticality to the work in a way that you can't if you are doing the more kind of academic critical design or speculative design where it's in galleries and books and preaching to the choir, like you said. But I can't help but wonder, and this is showing my kind of negativity about the future and all this too, is that there's a certain kind of like future capture in that these corporations have then now captured what we think of when we think of the future, that maybe it's not like science fiction anymore, but it's like all the rich CEOs of the various industries, not just tech, who are telling us what this stuff should look like now and be like and what the future will be like. And that has contributed to this lack of imagination that we've been talking about also. And so it's like, how much change is happening there versus in academia? Is it just the same where you're kind of just preaching to the choir and it's all kind of capitalist, like we're actually just feeding the bottom line? How I don't know if there's a question there, but I, other than to say I agree with you, but I also feel like that's not sufficient also, or am I missing something? Can you talk me through that?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think you're missing anything. I think what I'm proposing is maybe one step rather than the answer. And it's undoubtedly like we've experienced massive amounts of change, even in the last 50 years, certainly within the last 100 years.
Yeah.
My father, who lives in the UK, has experienced the world before the vinyl album and after ChatGPT.
Right, right.
That's quite a lot of change. And it's not just technological, it's societal change. Gay marriage is legal in over 40 countries now. We've had a
Hmm.
black president in the United States. There's
Hmm.
been a lot of change. Now, we're in an era right now where a lot of the change that's coming is coming from, I would say, one place, but driving into other territories. And that's sort of big tech at the moment.
Yeah, yeah.
It's steering a lot of the conversation about the future and sort of occupying the future. So when I say, hey, go into those big tech companies and steer them, I'm not saying that's the answer to changing the future,
Right.
but it is one way to sort of nudge the tiller a little bit and bring some other ways of thinking that you care about and other potential future stories into the mix a bit more. But you could just as easily get into politics. You could just as easily start your own thing and start telling different stories about the future. It's just that the might,
Right.
the
Right.
sort of the might at the moment is in that quarter. So playing in that quarter and being able to steer a little bit of it, I think that's where, if you feel strongly about a future that you wish to exert on the world, or at least nudge the direction of a company that is affecting the future, those are the companies to be focused on right now.
You mentioned being at the RCA in the 90s. I want to go back to that time for a second and just hear about how that shaped you. And so you went back to school in 1999, RCA. You were studying design products. You describe this era in the book as before smartphones, before high-speed internet. This is before the dot-com boom and bust. This feels like a very pivotal moment in both technology and culture. You write in the book that two of your professors were Anthony Dunn and Fiona Raby, who were, you describe them as approaching this era not with sparkly-eyed excitement, but deep intrigue and questioning skepticism. I love that line, deep intrigue and questioning skepticism. And I'm struck by how similar the way you describe 1999 at the RCA feels like 2025,
Hmm.
a time of radical technological and societal change. And this sense that everything is changing so fast. How do we make sense of it? How do we work through this? Where is all of this headed? And it seems to me that this idea of deep intrigue and questioning skepticism seems like a great way to approach this moment too. What did you take from that education? You weren't thinking about being a futures designer. You were not yet a reluctant futurist. How did being in that environment, in that culture, in that time of rapid change, how do you think that affected how you are approaching this work that you're doing now and the ideas in this book and the moment we're in right now?
I don't think it could be overstated how transformational my time at the Royal College of Art was, and my exposure to people like Dunn and Raby and the students that were in
Mm.
that cohort. But you don't notice it at the time,
Right.
obviously, too busy
Right.
getting drunk and making fun things. But as a context, I went in. My father was a railway engineer. I went into industrial design, did a Bachelor of Science, very technical. I was one of the sort of early engineering team at Dyson,
Hmm.
producing, consumer goods at scale. I sort of thought that's what my career was going to be, a more sort of artistic or applied engineering job, really,
Mm.
like giving things form and making them at scale. But
Hmm.
quite quickly, as I spent time doing it, and I probably could have done all right at that, but my heart was sort of wasn't really in it. So
Yeah.
I went to the Royal College of Art as a sort of recommendation of a flatmate, really. It was never a
Okay.
place that I'd like targeted in my dreams. It was just,
Nice.
he
Yeah.
said, you should go there. I think it'd be good for you. And so I went to do an MA in design products, and it was a 2 year course, lots of time to sort of stop and think. And the Royal College of Art is a sort of, well, it certainly was, it's a big stacked building, and every floor represents a discipline. This
Okay.
was the old J Muse building.
Okay.
Design products was on the second floor. You had architecture on the top floor. You had
Right.
ceramics and glass on the floor below. And so suddenly I didn't really do an art school education until I went there. And
Okay.
being around other people who were coming from sort of curatorial backgrounds and ceramics backgrounds and silk
Hmm.
screening things and
Hmm.
producing women's wear, and so that sort of dense environment was the first sort of awakening for me of like, oh, this is also design. Okay, I understand this now. But being around that particular moment where sort of critical design and speculative design, and we can go long on the
Yeah.
definitions between the two, but like that way of thinking about the future and technology and using design tools to tell stories that were on the edges of uh, critique, on the edges of academia, on the edges of writing, on the edges of
Yeah.
art and experiential things. Suddenly, my sort of mental portfolio of skills was just exploded. And so I went from being a dyed-in-the-wool industrial designer,
Interesting.
engineering drawings, CAD, manufacturing, through to making films, doing bits of writing, making
Mm,
sort of provocative objects,
yeah.
not for manufacture, And I can't tell you how much that's helped me in my career. And Tony and Fiona I consider them great friends and certainly mentors because of that. But other people too, the people that they created
Yeah.
their teaching in that era was really pivotal. When it comes to right now, I think you're absolutely right that there's this, and I don't think it's necessarily gone away. I just think it's sort of gained momentum and
Yeah.
grown
Yeah.
and grown and grown over the last 25, crikey, 25 years. Um, but I think it's getting to that point now where finding a way to, um, what do I really think here? It's a good point to stop and pause, but I don't want to be critical when I say this stuff finds its way into the galleries or into sort of art books. I think it has a place in those worlds. I think it has more to give though. And I do think
Mm,
it offers a way to sort of push back on the prevailing arguments about the future in a way that simple writing or simple statistical analysis
yeah.
doesn't. If you
Yeah.
provoke someone with a film or an object or a story or something experiential, I think they think about the future differently. And I would love to see more of that bleeding between politics and big tech and science and from the
Hmm.
sort of critical design world, rather than again, just if it's
Yeah.
just talking to itself, the conversation gets richer and richer, but tighter and tighter. And I think that dissemination of some of these ideas is an important next step for that work.
That's a great way to set up my last question, which I will tell you up front is another big question. We're circling back to the beginning of this conversation. I'm an educator. I spend my time thinking about what design students need to know today to have good careers 20 years from now. At the end of your book, you write, our population broadly lacks the verbal and visual vocabulary needed to imagine genuinely new things. I agree with that. I think that's what a lot of this conversation has been about. How do you think, do you have thoughts on how we educate for that? And especially, I'm thinking about the design students of today. How do we educate students to think both expansively and critically, visually and verbally about futures? Um, what are the actual kind of practical skills that you think are needed to do this work today?
It's really, really hard question. Obviously,
I told you I
yeah,
was ending
yeah.
big.
I'm not an educator. I'm very impressed by people that can do this work and become teachers of other designers. Um, I think when I was a student I started in 1994. My 4 year degree course was very focused on practical skills. There was a
Yeah.
workshop skill. I learned how to weld. I learned how to silver
Right.
solder. I learned how to use a lathe. Real hands-on practical skills. And the sort of critical thinking. We had maths and
Hmm.
like we had physics lessons and things like that. But the
Yeah.
actual critical thinking part of it was very, very small, I would say.
Uh,
I think that's changing. And I think it's partly because the sort of skills that you need, the tools that you need are changing so quickly. And I won't say easier to learn, but the practical skills required to produce design work. I'm really nervous about saying this out loud, but it feels like, let's say if I want to learn Figma, I can sort of do that in a long weekend.
yeah.
like
Yeah.
like the
Yeah.
actual practical tools to do things. And so
Yes.
therefore the weight falls on the ability to think. And I think one of the best things education can do is to give students the permission and the space and the time to think. And the culture of the
Mm.
crit is something that design has that I think a lot of other
Yeah.
disciplines don't.
Yeah.
And being able to sit and argue your case and be able to define what you mean and have people say, what do you mean? What do you mean? What do you mean? Why? Why? Why?
Yeah.
being able to be around that and be comfortable in that and be wrong and be able to change and reshape your perspectives is a key part of being able to imagine more expansively. I think if you just trust the data and say this is coming, or if you just build a manifesto and try and make it so, without listening or looking laterally or trying different avenues or experimenting or producing different things, your imagination suffers. So I think less of a focus on developing the execution skills, I think, in education, more time. Like if you and I were to set up a new Bauhaus or something today, it would be quite hard for me to know what should be on the syllabus other than lots of time and lots of sort of headline questions and say, you've got 3 months, come back with something.
Yeah.
Rather than week 1 is wood lathe, week 2 is metal lathe. You know, it's hard for me to know what a syllabus would be. But I do think making space for crit and making space for discussion, debate, disagreement, and building your own ability to communicate what you think and what you mean is a real skill. And defining what design is an ever expanding and an ever more pointless conversation.
Yeah.
But I think it's hard now to know what really we mean when we say design, and it can be so many things. So the one thing I think that unifies it all is this ability to ask good questions, understand people, understand the shape of the world, and then use tools to help communicate that outwards to other people. And that's what I always try and focus on.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's a great way to wrap up this conversation, because I think that's what you're doing in this book, actually, is I think you're trying to make space for us generally, the public, to think about the futures that are being presented to us, to say, okay, then what? What now? Why this? Where is this going? I actually think that's the tools that I got from this book. The book is called Could, Should, Might, Don't, How We Think About the Future. I loved it. I marked it up. I thought about it so much, and I feel like it was a way for me to kind of like think out loud with you through this conversation. So thank you so much for writing the book and for being on the show. I really, really enjoyed this. I really appreciate it.
No worries. And again, whether could, should, might, and don't are the right corridors, or like I don't know. What I'm more interested in is the fact that we all collectively can have a conversation about how we think about the future. And I think we can all agree that we're coming up short. And so I've just tried to offer something up to try and start conversations like this. So I do appreciate you inviting me on for the lovely chat.
That was my conversation with Nick Foster. His new book is called Could, Should, Might, Don't, How We Think About the Future. It's available wherever books are sold. Our theme music is by Jeremiah Chu. This show is funded thanks to the generosity of listeners like you. If you like what we're doing, I hope you consider supporting us on Substack and get some bonus content each month. You can follow us across social media at Surface Podcast, and you can listen to all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at our website, scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.